So I went a little bit into the affirmative process generally, who would be applying affirmatively and having an application for asylum pending before USCIS in the first place. So typically that's going to be people like yourselves, people who entered the United States lawfully using a visa, or were in some type of status, people who entered unlawfully but didn't have an encounter with immigration, or people who entered the United States with some kind of fraudulent documents, and then unaccompanied alien children, which are children who arrive at the southern border without a parent or guardian. So just sort of understanding the process, right? So you complete your application, your Form I-589, you submit it, you have a biometrics appointment where you are fingerprinted, and then you wait for your interview. And the interview waiting process can vary significantly. Some people have an interview in as little as, 30 or 60 days, and some people have been waiting for 9 years and still haven't had an interview. If once you have your affirmative application and your interview, if it is approved, then you will have asylee status. If it is not approved, it will go to the court. Alternatively, some people are applying for asylum directly with the immigration court and never go through that affirmative process. So to kind of just see the flow of it, that's sort of what it looks like, and then you receive your decision after your interview. So as I mentioned earlier, it's sort of unpredictable about when your interview will be scheduled. So starting in 2018, this asylum office started a last in, first out policy where they take a certain percentage of cases as people are actually applying, and they're immediately scheduling them for interviews within about 21. They're scheduling the interviews within about 21 days of application. So this is some small percentage of people as they're applying. And then they prioritize oops, people. There we go. Then they prioritize people who were scheduled for an interview previously and needed to be rescheduled. So that's the first. And then the second is that LIFO, the 21 days. And then it's any pending applications that have been pending for longer. So it seems sort of random. Lately, what I have been seeing just on the ground is an aggressive move towards scheduling recently applied asylums and also long pending asylums. So I have clients who applied maybe in somewhere between 2016 and 2018 who've been waiting a long time for their interviews, and they're now finally getting scheduled for interviews. And then I have a lot of clients who applied in 2024 who are now being scheduled for interviews. And then as we're applying initial applications, they're being scheduled pretty quickly. So it's a pretty large variety of people who are being scheduled for interviews, and it's very clear that the asylum office has an assignment to interview people. Like that is very clear across the board from every practitioner I know. We're seeing a huge increase in asylum interviews, and it's clearly a priority of this administration. So as you probably already know, it can be as short as 21 days that your application is pending or as long as 9 years. And of course, after 150 days of your application pending, you are eligible for apply for a work permit. That is a separate process that you do have to go through. So outcomes of decisions. So if it's a grant of asylum, then you're going to get an approval letter. You'll get a Form I-94, which is this like little white card. It's like a little square of your name on it, an I-94 number, and it'll say that you have been granted asylum indefinitely. And that will come for you and any derivatives who are present in the United States that were included in your application. If it's a denial, an outright denial is really rare. It would be very unusual. I haven't really seen that. Typically what happens is you're referred to immigration court. So the officer has some reason they cannot approve your asylum application. It doesn't mean you don't qualify for asylum. Sometimes there are legal issues, like perhaps you didn't file within 1 year of arriving in the United States. Sometimes there are other complications, or sometimes the officer just takes a conservative view of asylum, whatever it may be, they will send your application to the asylum court. Where you will have the opportunity to basically redo the process again with the immigration courts. You'll have an official hearing where you'll present all of the information all over again to an immigration judge, and the judge will make a final decision in your case. And even if you don't win with the immigration court, you have the right to appeal that decision. So it's not even the final word. To kind of go through that whole window of that, it's either going to be a grant, or if it's referred to the immigration court, then you would go through the defensive asylum process. And you can even go to the BIA, which is the Board of Immigration Appeals, and appeal. So it's a long process. There's a lot of opportunities to be successful in the asylum world when you're starting with an affirmative application. And you're really in the best possible position for success when you are able to start with an affirmative application. So if you're granted asylum status, then or asylee status, then you no longer need a work permit. So you can get one. You are allowed to apply for one, but they are not required. The little piece of paper, that I-94 I mentioned earlier, that is proof of work authorization, which is a huge benefit. You don't have to worry about having that work permit. Of course, some people like to have a work permit because it's a form of ID, and that can be helpful in life. So certainly you're eligible to apply for one, but it's not required. You can also apply for a refugee travel document, which would give you permission to travel internationally. Obviously, you cannot go back to your country, but I mean, I'm sure you don't want to. But you can go to other places, and so a refugee travel document is a great option once you have asylee status. You're also eligible for significant financial benefits and assistance. And medical assistance, English training courses. There's actually quite a lot of benefits that you can be eligible for as an asylee. And if there are people in your family, a spouse or children who at the time that you applied for asylum were under the age of 21, who are not currently in the United States, you can file a petition for them to also be asylees. And then about a year. So you're eligible to receive lawful permanent residence after 1 year. You technically can apply before that 1 year mark. I've currently, been recommending people apply closer than 9 months. I used to do 6 months, and that hasn't been an issue. I just feel a little bit wary in this administration, so I've been leaning towards at that 9 month post approval mark for people applying for asylum, or excuse me, for their residency. And another benefit that's not listed here is that once you are granted residency, instead of having to wait 5 years to apply for your naturalization, you only have to wait 4 years. So that's a little benefit that asylees have. So that's all the good stuff, but let's talk about how we get there. Okay. So one thing that is new that many of you may be aware is that you can now apply for asylum online if you have a USCIS online account. This is a great option because it's easy to upload the documents. It's easy to get updates from them, and it's a great process. I think everyone here already applied for asylum, so either you did it online or you didn't, so maybe too late, but I do want to put a plug out there because online filing is a really wonderful and accessible way to apply for asylum. So one issue that could come up in your affirmative interview is the 1 year filing deadline. So you are required to apply for asylum within 1 year. There are other things that could come up that may prevent you from becoming eligible for asylum, and I just want to mention them. And if any of these issues you think might apply to you, I definitely would encourage you to talk to your attorney about them, or if you don't have an attorney, definitely seek legal advice about these issues. So outside of the 1 year filing deadline, which says that you have to apply for asylum within 1 year of arriving to the United States, and there are exceptions to that, so don't worry. An exception may apply to your case, so it's not a blanket bar. There are lots of exceptions, okay? If you in your interview admit to persecuting other people, that would be a bar to asylum. If you've been convicted of an aggravated felony or a particularly serious crime in the United States, that would be a bar to asylum. So I highly recommend, if you have any criminal convictions in the United States, that you touch base with an attorney about the impact that conviction could have on your asylum case. Commission of a serious non-political crime outside of the United States. So if in your home country or in some other country you've committed a serious crime that wasn't political in nature, then potentially that could be a bar to asylum. If you are viewed as a danger to national security, that could be a bar to asylum. This can come up in the in really odd contexts. Mostly it's when you have some type of connection to an international organization that the government views as being a danger to national security. So sometimes those connections are strong and obvious, and sometimes those connections can be more distant. So if you're wondering about maybe you have a connection to an organization that you think would be viewed as a threat to national security for the United States, I would definitely consult an attorney about that connection and how best to address that in your asylum interview. There's also terrorist activity and material support to terrorism. So this could be something as simple as financially supporting a group that is on a US terrorist list, or even making food for a group that is on the US terrorist list. And this is one that comes up more often than you think because number one, we do things under duress quite often in the asylum context. And two, you know, we're often, being threatened with harm, it's duress, right? Like we do a lot of things under duress. So if at any point you provided financial assistance or any type of physical assistance, i.e., making food, cleaning, doing anything like that, um, paid an extortion fee, anything like that, to a group that has violence as its central tool, then I would consult with an attorney just to double check how best to present that information in your asylum interview. It's something that you can overcome. It's not an automatic bar inherently. There's a lot of factors involved. So I think an attorney would be best equipped to hear the facts and really understand um, what what happened and how best to present that in an interview. Safe third country agreement it won't apply to anyone really in an affirmative process typically, but that's basically where you landed in Canada first and then came to the United States, basically. Um, a prior denial of asylum will be denied again unless you can demonstrate changed circumstances. And if you were previously ordered removed from the United States and then were deported and returned, then you would have your removal order reinstated. So those are all your bars to asylum. So not to get us off on a negative foot, but just some things to think about when you're trying to think about preparing for your interview, and whether or not you're not sure if you need an attorney. I think if you're looking at all this and you're like, none of that has anything to do with my case, you're going to be okay, But if you're looking at this and you're like, oh my gosh, this is really my life, I would reach out to an attorney for some advice. Okay, so preparing for your interview. So, interview notice. At some point, you're going to get a notice in the mail or in your USCIS online account, letting you know that your interview's been scheduled. Um, it's typical that you receive that notice about 2 to 3 weeks before the actual interview. I have been receiving notices a bit earlier recently. For example, I received a notice at the beginning of June for an interview that's taking place in the middle of July, and that's like more like 6 weeks notice, which is kind of a lot. But it could be as little as 2 weeks. So my suggestion, if you are planning on submitting additional documents, you probably submitted a lot of evidence with your original application. But if there is other evidence that you have that you want to submit, my suggestion is to make sure you have it now, like before your interview is scheduled. You do not want to be in the situation where you are scrambling and you're trying to get all of your evidence prepared a week before your interview, and get everything translated and everything together and everything submitted. So I highly recommend that if there is other evidence, if you're like, there are more documents that I want the government to have in order to make a decision on my asylum case, I highly recommend that you seek those documents now. Especially because, they're not going to expire, right? You can always get more, right? So, I mean, I think My suggestion is kind of like every year that you're waiting for your interview, kind of review the documents you have and think about like, are there more documents I should think about gathering? Are there refreshing? Is there refreshing information I want to make sure I would have at my interview? It's easy to get a news article and print it. So you don't need to worry about necessarily news articles that are going to be about the current situation in your country. But, the longer you're in the United States, the harder it can be to maintain contact with people back home who know about what happened to you, who know about the danger you face, who know the details of your situation. And so really trying to get declarations from those people who can attest to the danger you face and the danger you experienced, that's going to be important to do that earlier on rather than later. So I highly recommend that. USCIS currently has a policy that if you want to submit supplemental documents for your interview, that you need to get them to the asylum office 7 days before the interview. You cannot submit them in person. They can only be done by mail. Okay. And you're going to mail it to the address on the asylum interview notice. If for some reason you're unable to comply with that deadline, I highly recommend you still bring them to your interview, okay? It'll be up to the officer to decide what to do with those documents, but it is worth just trying it, especially if you're appearing without an attorney. A lot of officers are pretty flexible about receiving documents when you don't have an attorney, especially, but even when you do. So I highly recommend bringing the documents to the interview and attempting to present them in person. But remember that everything has to be translated into English. So do not bring untranslated documents to your interview. They will not be accepted. So if you want to bring something, I say if you want them to have it, get it translated and submitted 7 days before the interview. Failing to do that, bring them in person, hard copy to the interview, but you know, have it translated. You should also bring all original documents in general. So any document you previously submitted, you should bring the original of to the interview and have that ready to present. You're also required to bring your own interpreter. And I highly recommend that you use an interpreter, even if you are very strong in English. The only time I've ever had a client not use an interpreter is someone who was literally an English interpreter in Afghanistan. But we still had to bring an interpreter for his family members because he can't interpret for them. So I highly, highly recommend that you bring an interpreter, regardless of how strong you are in English. The best way I describe that is okay, typically when we're talking about asylum, we're talking about events that occurred in our native language, right? So I speak Spanish. My Spanish is pretty good, but I live my life mostly in English and I speak Spanish in very specific contexts. So if I was thinking about a traumatic event that happened to me in English and someone wanted me to describe it in Spanish, that is a bigger challenge than just describing it in English, right? So because I experienced it in English, it's easiest for me to describe it in English. If I experienced it in Spanish, then it would be easier for me to describe it in Spanish. And so when you're nervous and you're, in this room and with this officer who's asking you these questions, you're going to want to be able to explain it in the language you experienced it in. It will help to do it that way. So I highly recommend that you bring an interpreter. You also have to bring everyone you've included in your application who's in the United States. So if you have, a spouse and you said that they're included in your application, your spouse has to come. If you have children, as and you've said that they're included in your application, they have to come. It doesn't matter what age they are. It doesn't matter if they didn't have to be fingerprinted. It doesn't matter if they're 2 years old. The 2-year-old has to come to the interview. Okay. And it's really important that everyone comes and everyone must bring a photo ID. Maybe not a 2-year-old, but pretty much everyone. I've had them ask for photo ID for like a 9-year-old recently. I had to like get their profile from school because a 9-year-old doesn't have a photo ID. And we can't get a passport for them. It's just bizarre, but everyone needs to have some sort of photo ID. So anticipate that, including the interpreter. If you're using a friend or a community member to be an interpreter rather than a professional interpreter, make sure they bring an ID. I recently had someone show up there, the interpreter didn't have an ID. It was turned into a whole headache. So make sure they have their ID. Okay. So, um, having your actual interview at the asylum office in Arlington. So, I do want to note that USCIS just announced that they're going to begin doing asylum interviews at the USCIS office in Maryland for people living in Maryland. This is a brand new thing that has never happened before. Up until now, if you lived in Maryland, you always had your asylum interview at the Arlington Asylum office. There is no asylum office in Maryland, it's a USCIS office. But because they're focused so much on processing asylum claims, they're going to begin hearing asylum interviews in Maryland. I don't have details about what that's going to look like or how it would differ from an interview in Arlington, simply because it's a brand new policy and I have not attended or even seen an interview notice for Maryland. I assume it's in the Baltimore office, but I'm not even totally clear on that. But that's where USCIS is in Maryland, is in Baltimore. So today I'm going to focus on what it's like to do an asylum interview in Arlington because that's the experience I have, and that's where most people have their interviews. So first thing off the bat, parking in Arlington. So there's a grocery store. I think it's a Safeway. There's also a parking past it. So if you turn into the Safeway, just go through the parking in Safeway and turn right, and you can go down and park below the building. Otherwise, if you don't turn in the Safeway, you just go right up above it, just north of the Safeway, and you turn into the parking and go down. I know that sounds really silly and like, why am I talking about parking? But when you're nervous and you're trying to get there, just kind of having that idea of where to park your car will help. Once you park, you're going to go into, there's like a central area where you can get on an elevator. You're going to go up to the third floor. The elevators require you to tell them what floor you're going to, and then the elevator will tell you which letter elevator to get into. Okay. So make sure you get into the right elevator. So if you're going to the third floor, they're going to say, get in elevator C. If elevator E opens and you get into that elevator, it could go anywhere. And there's no buttons inside for you to press it. So look at the screen, see which letter elevator it tells you to get into, and get into the correct elevator so you don't end up just sort of in a random place or stuck somewhere. I do recommend that you do not arrive more than 30 minutes before your scheduled interview time. The security guards are not supposed to let you in more than 30 minutes before. It used to be 15 minutes, but recently it seems like they're kind of been a little bit more comfortable letting people 30 minutes beforehand. So you should be okay at 30 minutes, but don't come before that. You're going to stand in line for security, and you're going to put your bag through a security conveyor and then be checked with a metal detector, right? So you can bring your cell phone in, it's not an issue. Electronics are fine. Um, and generally you can bring in water. Sometimes they give a hard time about food, but if you have a small children, it's usually fine. So just things to be aware of. Once you arrive and you pass through security, you're going to get in a line and you need to check in at the window. When you check in at the window, your whole family checks in with you. You bring your interpreter all to the window. If you have an attorney, then you'll check in with your attorney, your interpreter, and your whole family at the window. You're going to show them your interview notice. They'll ask for identification, and then they'll let you know that you can sit down in the chairs and wait till your A number is called. Typically, it's either they'll call out when it's time your turn to be interviewed, they'll call out either the last three or the last four numbers of your A number, and this is for the primary person on the asylum claim, okay? It used to always just be three, but recently they've been doing four, but sometimes they still do three, so yeah, just pay attention. They also have your photo, so often they can kind of eyeball who is supposed to be interviewed, and they'll call it out multiple times. Okay, so let's say you're in there, they call your number. Okay, so now we're in the interview. So when the officer calls out your A number, for you and your family, we'll go into the interview room. It's like an office. There's a desk, a computer, an iPad set up, and then like a couple rows of chairs. So you'll sit with the interpreter and your family members in the rows of chairs. There will also be a second interpreter on the phone, on speakerphone, and they're going to be monitoring their interpreting to make sure it's accurate. This serves two purposes. Number one, it's designed to avoid fraud, where an interpreter is just going to go in and just say whatever magical answer they're supposed to say, and you have no idea. It also just helps, like when you have a community member or friend interpreting, sometimes they struggle with little things, and they're able to assist the interpreter to interpret for you, especially when we get into like technical legal language, which does come up a little bit in the asylum interview. So the monitor might make interruptions. Don't worry, they're there to help. And things are going to go fine if they're even if they're in. I just had an interview and the interpreter interrupted a few times and it was not a problem. It was all good. Okay, so initially the officer will go over biographic information for each of the applicants. So obviously you know your case and your family best. What I typically do in a family setting where there's a primary adult who is the one who either has experienced harm or is likely to experience harm. And then there is a spouse and children who were not present for the harm, were not involved in the harm, or are unlikely to experience the harm, um, or maybe only experience the harm through this one primary person. I asked the officer to go through all of the required questions for biographical and bar questions for the spouse and children and excuse them. Children do not need to be in the room while you describe in painful detail every ugly thing that has happened to you or will happen to you. It's traumatic for them. It's difficult for you to be honest when they're there because you want to protect them. You don't feel comfortable giving the whole truth. And sometimes that's even true in front of a spouse, because we have to talk about really difficult things in asylum interviews. So I've never had an officer push back on getting done with the biographical information first for the family members and then letting them wait outside. They actually don't even have to wait in the asylum office. They can go down to the lobby. There's a very nice lobby in the building with like chairs and tables. It's like a cute little business setup, and you can have them hang out down there, or they can leave and go walk around. I mean, depending on the time of day, go get a coffee, go get a lunch, whatever they need. But asylum interviews are long. A typical length is 2 to 5 hours. Two is rare. That would be a very quick interview. I would say on average they're about 3 hours. And I've had many that take 5 hours. I have had interviews take 8 hours. They're long. It's a lot of details. So best to just get them out and then focus on the task at hand. Something that's a little bit unique about asylum interviews is the officers ask very generalized questions. They'll ask follow-up questions for you to add, to like clarify a detail, but a lot of the questions are like open-ended and generalized. So it's really your job to make sure that you're getting the information and the important details out to the officer. So it's possible that you submitted a declaration and lots of evidence in support of your case, but even so, it's important that in the interview, you're saying the words about what happened to you or why you fear returning to your country. So I find it's best, you know, to think about things. Officers like things in a timeline, right? So questions that they often ask are going to be, let's say it's a situation where you were harmed multiple times. So they're going to say, have you ever been harmed in your home country? And you're going to say, yes, I've been harmed. How many times were you harmed? So maybe you know for certain it was only 2 times. So you're going to say 2 times. But also maybe you're like, I don't know, it was like a lot of times. They harmed me many, many times. Like it was constant. There's not a number, and they're going to try very hard to push you to a number. So, really be very clear when you're making an estimation. Like, I don't know, it was many times. I was harmed, once a week on average over the course of 9 months, right? That gives them an idea, but it's not committing to a number. Unless you know the number, don't say a number, okay? Don't just like guess at a random number, because they're going to hold you to that number for the entirety of the interview. They're going to say, okay, well, when was the first time? What happened? When was the second time? What happened? So it's really important that you're very honest about what you know and what you remember and what you're like, I estimate it's this, because that can kind of mess with your interview. And if you start saying contradicting details, that can deeply impact the outcome of your asylum interview. Also, the officer is taking notes during your interview. It's not a transcript, but it's pretty detailed notes about the questions that are being asked and the answers you're given. And if for some reason the officer does not approve your asylum claim at the interview or at the end of the interview process, that those notes, they're going to go to the immigration court. And the immigration court will have those details. So if you mess up a fact there, then that's going to impact the outcome of your removal proceedings as well. So just take a deep breath, think about the answer. If at any point you realize you said something incorrectly, say it. Say, like, earlier you asked me this question and I said this, but now that I'm thinking about it, the answer is this. So just be very clear about it. And officers, they're understanding, they understand trauma, they understand, you know, how talking about things can be challenging. They're understanding. So just be honest, take a deep breath and try and be clear. But definitely the number of times you were harmed and the order of events, the dates in which they happened, those are typically how the officers want to hear the story first time, second time, third time. So try and prepare your brain to think about it like that. Because oftentimes we don't think about the world first time, second time, third time. We think about like, oh, where there was that worst time that was the scariest, and there was like that other time that was really terrible. And then there was, so we don't always think about it in order. So try and prepare yourself to think about it in order because the officers really like you to put it in order: first, second, third, 10th. Okay. So once you've completed your very long interview, the officer will talk to you about how you're going to receive the decision. So the interview decision is either sent to you by mail, and the officer will say, you're going to receive your decision by mail, or they're going to give you a date to return and get the decision. I recently heard that they are making everyone return after 2 weeks. I haven't seen that so far, but that was a policy that was announced, that they're going to start making everyone return after 2 weeks and come in person to receive a decision. I don't know if that's real. I'm just gonna be honest, like supposedly that's it. But my colleague was in the asylum office today and she was told she was gonna get the decision by mail. So who knows? Um, but you will receive it one way or the other. If it's by mail, you receive it by mail or in your USCIS account. If it's return date, it's typically 2 weeks. So what happens when you return to receive your decision? One of two things happen when you return. You either get the decision or you get informed that you're going to receive the decision via mail. So do not think that something went wrong if you're told come back in 2 weeks for your decision and you show up back there and they're like, actually, the decision's not ready. You're going to receive it by mail. Do not think that that's a bad sign. It's not. It's totally normal. It's very typical. It happens all the time. It has no bearing on the outcome of your case. So there are people who come back after 2 weeks, get told to receive it by mail, and it's get granted. There are people who come back after 2 weeks and told they're going to receive it by mail, and it gets referred to the immigration court. It has no bearing on the outcome. It just means that the officer just was not able to complete the decision within 2 weeks. So don't stress about the 2 weeks piece. How long will it take if it's going to be mailed? Impossible to say. Ideally within 3 months is like often what happens, and then sometimes within 6 months, and then sometimes there are people who have been waiting on asylum decisions for multiple years, right? So I do want to say that you do have the option to sue the government if you're waiting too long for an asylum decision, and certainly like more than 6 months, you're getting into the area where I think you could sue the government. And it's something that you could seek counsel to discuss if you're really wanting a decision. Or you can enjoy being able to be here, renewing your work permit, and living without, constant fear that, you're going to be in removal proceedings. I don't know. So some things that people are worried about if they're told to return to the asylum office to pick up the decision, or going to the asylum office itself for the interview, is will they be detained? So I can tell you that up until now, we have not seen ICE at the asylum office. So we have seen ICE detaining people in immigration courts. That is happening nationwide. It is happening in this area. Absolutely, it is happening. We have not seen people getting detained at the asylum office. Does that mean it won't happen? No, I can't promise you it won't happen. But I can tell you right now that that has not been the trend. Neither for the interview itself, nor when people are going back to pick up their decisions. So unfortunately, in this administration, I just cannot make you a guarantee. But generally, that's not what we're seeing. What other things can go wrong? So generally, not a lot is going to go wrong at the asylum office as long as you are prepared to tell your story, you're honest with the officer, and you have the documents to back up your story. Or if there's no documents, which happens sometimes, you're just honest and you tell a clear story. If for some reason, something that could go wrong is that the officer could say that they don't believe you and that your documents are fraudulent. I don't think that's going to apply to anyone in this group. Um, it's a pretty rare circumstance at the asylum office that something like that would happen. Um, and that's why I encourage you to bring your original documents so that you can show that they are real. And that's going to be your protection against something like that. Okay, so that concludes my presentation about what the interview looks like and what the process is like. I do want to say, like, a lot of the asylum officers are really wonderful in Arlington. I have a good friend who is a supervisory asylum officer. I've known her for many years. She's a former immigration attorney. She has a lot of experience representing immigrants in asylum claims. And she is intimately involved in the training of asylum officers, and it is her like passion to make sure that they are knowledgeable and capable. And yeah, so I just want to say, like, obviously there's bad apples in all groups, I'm sure, but I think that the Arlington Asylum Office is one of the better asylum offices nationwide. They have a very high approval rate of cases, like just very, very high. And I think that they do work really hard to get things right. So I think, you're living in a good place. If you're going to the asylum office in Arlington, you're in very good hands in terms of the asylum officers. So what questions do you guys have?
Thank you. Thank you, Brianna. That's very interesting. I mean, I was imagining the whole steps when you were explaining the process. You're right. I mean, at us, at Lincoln Asylum Office, we really have a good approval rates, and we're celebrating our client success every week on a group meeting. We usually like say, okay, I have a client who's just got approved. So that's really interesting to hear. I don't know. I'm not sure about other asylum offices, but we really have a good approval rate at here at the local office. But I just based on the questions that I usually receive, I have like two questions. The first one
Yep.
is about like you said, the process is not that easy. People get nervous and it's very daunting and people frustrated to go for their interview. So what are the basic most common mistakes people usually make during or in the course of a preparation or during their interview? And the second thing that you mentioned is also like people on in their interview, they talk about their traumatic experiences, what happened to them. So that by itself sometimes make re-traumatize people. So what about like the officer ask questions that the applicant is not comfortable to respond in that, what should the client should do in that situation? Thank you.
So most common mistakes, I would say, are people not listening to the question being asked. So the officer asks a question and your head is so full of information and you just want the officer to get all of the information. And so you've thought about everything really hard and you have all these points you want to make sure you make, right? And so instead of listening to the question and answering the question, they ask a question and the person just starts talking about whatever they want about their past experience. It frustrates officers and it can confuse the story. So it's really, really important that when the officer asks a question, you take a deep breath, you think to yourself, okay, what are they asking for? What is the question they're asking you? What is the information they want? And then you respond to the question. Now, sometimes you can add in additional details if you think that they're important or it naturally flows from that. That's fine. I'm not saying like give short answers. You can give lots of long answers, but more importantly, it's about making sure you're actually asking the question that's being you're actually answering the question that's being asked. Um, Another common mistake is sort of what I was mentioning before, which is that people just answer the question like, oh, I was harmed 2 times. But actually, it was like a lot more than that. And they just get nervous and they just want to give an answer. So they just say the answer because they just want to be able to answer the question. And it really is important that you are only committing to an answer like that when you know that's the answer. If you're not sure, it's really important that you say, I estimate it is about. I remember that it happened, like if they're asking about when something happened, I remember it happened in the fall of the year before I came here. You know what I mean? Give estimations. It's really important that you're very honest about what you're certain about and what you're not certain about. You're never going to have a problem in an asylum interview if you're like, I'm not sure if it was June or July of 2016, but it was somewhere around there. Versus if you're like, it was July 16th. And then later on, you're like, it was July 18th. And then later on, you're like, it was August 1st. That's a problem. So it's really important that you only commit to like facts like that when it's just inside of you, you know you're never going to make that mistake. Um, Another common mistake is that people talk too long and the interpreter cannot interpret everything that they say, and things get very confusing very fast. It is incredibly important that you take a sentence. You say your sentence, you take a pause. It doesn't mean you don't get to keep talking, but you let the interpreter interpret. It's important that you practice this. So if you are having a friend interpret for you, if you are using a professional interpreter while you guys are sitting out in the waiting room, wherever, practice telling a story. It doesn't have to be about your asylum claim. It doesn't have to be about anything. It can be about your breakfast that morning. You know what I mean? But practice telling the story with the interpreter so the interpreter can kind of hear how you talk, get your pace, and let you know how much information you can give them before you have to pause. And look at your interpreter when you're talking because they're going to let you know. They're going to put up a hand. They're going to do something to let you know you need to stop talking. And it is hard. This is a very difficult thing. You are talking about a difficult topic. You're talking about traumatic events. It's hard to talk about in general, and now you have to remember to pause. That's difficult. It takes some practice. But if you just keep talking, what happens is the interpreter doesn't interpret everything you're saying, and you don't know what they got and they didn't get, which means you don't know what the officer actually heard and what they didn't hear, which means you don't actually know where you are in your story. So interpretation mistakes can be really problematic. And there is that person on the phone there to help and correct. But if you're talking too long for even both of them, they can only help so much. So take those pauses. At any point, if the officer starts to ask another question before you finish your story, say, oh, sorry, I'm not done. Can I please finish? And that's totally fine to do. Um, in terms of talking about traumatic events in the interview, so, okay, first, remember that you can ask for a break. Like this is difficult. We're talking about, I mean, obviously I don't know everyone's personal life experiences, but based on many years of experience, I can say that most of my clients are talking about the worst events of their entire lives, right? Things that they happened sometimes many years ago that they've worked very hard to not think about for the last few years, to try and move on from, to try and get away from, right? And now we're asking you to rehash all of it in an interview with a stranger, right? It's a very uncomfortable process. So you are allowed to take a break and you are allowed to ask for a break. You are allowed to ask to get a sip of water. You are allowed to ask to use the restroom. You are allowed to just say, I need 5 minutes, I need 10 minutes, whatever it is. That is totally fine. And you should do it if you need it, honestly, because you are not going to help yourself if you need a break and you're having a hard time and you're not giving yourself that break. You're going to end up not answering questions fully and forgetting details because you're going to be thinking about, I just want to get out of this room. I just want this interview to be over. I just want to get out of this room. I don't care anymore. I don't care what the result is. I just need to get out of this room. That's the response. That's the trauma response. I need to get out of here. When you start thinking, I need to get out of here, is this over? I need to get out of this room. You need to say, I need a break. You have to say it. It's crucially important. Take the break, drink some water, go to the bathroom, splash some water on your face, take some deep breaths, calm your body. And then when the officer will let you resume afterwards, okay? Um, if you are uncomfortable telling your story to the officer, um, there are a few different circumstances that might come up. Number one, it could be the gender of the officer, right? So maybe you had some really ugly things happen to you as a woman, and the officer is male, and you don't feel comfortable talking about what happened to you because they're male. You are allowed to say, I don't feel comfortable talking about these things with a man, and I would like a female officer. They may or may not be able to accommodate you on that day. It could impact whether you're able to complete the interview, but you can say that and ask for a female officer. Um, if and the same true, like if you're a man and you would prefer to talk to a man because it's special men things, you can also say that. Um, if you are overall unable to talk about an event, so unfortunately, you're going to have to talk about it with someone. That's just the truth. Like there are just things that you really need to be able to express in your interview. Um, if you have a very, very hard time talking about things, I highly suggest you get a psychological evaluation to support your inability to talk about an event so that there is evidence of why you struggle with that. A professional can explain the level of trauma that you've experienced, that you do experience, and you can submit that in support of your asylum application. And I think that's the smartest way to sort of handle that. So if you know you're going to have like, look, I have a client who had a removal hearing, an asylum removal hearing, and we prepared a declaration in advance and we had her get a psychological evaluation because she could not get through testimony. She just couldn't. She was not capable of talking about sorry, my kiddo is crying up there. I hope you guys can't hear it. She was not capable of talking about the very, very deeply traumatic things that happened to her. So that's what we did. We prepared a detailed declaration. It took a lot of appointments to get that declaration prepared because she couldn't do it in one sitting. And then we had her get a psychological evaluation to explain the level of post-traumatic stress disorder that she has and how much it significantly impacts her to talk about those events. And ultimately, I was able to get the court and DHS to waive her testimony. It was not easy, it was complicated. That's not usual. So my suggestion is to get a psychological evaluation, but be prepared. They want you to tell your story. So I always say the worst part about the asylum process is that you are dealing with people who have experienced trauma, and then the process essentially exists to re-traumatize that person over and over again. And it's just an ugly reality that I don't have a solution for so far. Um, any other questions?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm gonna stop recording, so